If it's the 15th of the month, it's time to take a dive into my weird record collection.
Dare to be great. Ha ha ha. The greatest con game in the world.
Hello, everybody. This is episode number 21 of my weird record collection. My name is Sean, coming to you from the city of Chicago, and I hereby invite you, dear listener, into my odd world of strange, miscellaneous, and otherwise uncategorizable media for your turntable. I bought these records so you don't have to, although I highly encourage you to do so anyway. But regardless, in this episode, episode 21, we're going to be looking at a record called Dare to Be Great by MLM mogul Glenn W. Turner. But before I do that, I just want to give a couple of updates. First of all, I got some interesting feedback here and there about episode 20. I think overall, the general consensus about Will They Know It's Summertime is that the song itself is a sham. Their words, not mine. So forgive me, those involved. And I can totally understand why somebody would think that this was just something for maybe station publicity, but I really don't think 91X ever needed the publicity. That was never a problem for them. But yeah, I got some comments about how I find the weirdest things, and I don't think this even scratches the surface, to be quite honest with you. But also, I should give another update on my quest for the Makaha sessions. Just a quick catch up for those who don't know the story. Record Store Day this past April, one of the records that was released specifically for Record Store Day was called the Makaha Sessions, which was several years ago. A few members of the Hollywood elite group of session musicians, sometimes called the Wrecking Crew, sometimes called the Clique, sometimes called the First Call Gang, because they were the first people you'd call if you had a recording session. A few of them got together and recorded a bunch of songs, and there were some additional musicians as well. And I really wanted the thing. Problem: very few stores actually received copies, and none of the stores in my area had it, but a friend out of state saw it at his store, so he bought it for me, shipped it to me while it was literally en route to my house. When it was out for delivery, our carrier decided to return it to sender, claiming that my name was not on my mailbox. Spoiler alert, yes it was. So they had to return it to the sender. And in the process of being returned to sender, the package got lost somewhere in my friend's metropolitan area. Well, so far, you put in the tracking number of the package, there's nothing there anymore. It just dropped off the face of the earth. And my friend still has not heard back from his appeal for an insurance claim on the package. But in the meantime, I did find a vendor on Discogs.com. Well, actually, several vendors on Discogs.com had copies in stock. So I found one with a good reputation. And interestingly, the cost was about half of what I would have paid in the store. And I have it now. Not the copy my friend sent me, but a different copy. And I'm happy to have it. I listened to it. Overall, it's pretty good. The only thing is there are a few Beach Boys covers on it. There's Good Vibrations, Wouldn't It Be Nice, and Sloop John B. Gotta say, I'm not a fan of those particular versions. Good Vibrations, some parts of it, there's a little bit too much effort put in, and other parts there wasn't enough effort put in. Wouldn't It Be Nice? The vocals are kind of harsh and loud. Probably should have been mixed down a little bit. And Sloop John B was actually okay, but I don't know. There were a few things missing from it, but there's a wonderful performance of Be My Baby sung by Lisa Michaels, Mychols, by the way. She sounded fantastic on that, no surprise. And I really dug the performance of Monday Monday on the record. It's basically a carbon copy of the Mamas and Papas version, but still it was a really cool listen. And David Marks, who was a Beach Boy on two separate occasions, literally 50 years apart, he has a couple of instrumentals on it that are really cool. So, hey, I have the record. I'm happy. I just hope that my friend out in the other state does get his insurance claim and somehow gets reimbursed for the money that it cost in a haul, I guess. But now that I've talked about all that, let's take a look at this episode's feature. But before we do, let's look at the person behind Dare to Be Great. And that is the, I guess, legendary Glenn W. Turner. Glenn Wesley Turner was born August 19th, 1934, and I realize that his birthday is only 4 days after the release date of this episode, August 15th, 2025, but I promise you, dear listener, that was just a coincidence. I literally had no idea what his birthday was until after I already started prepping the episode. But anyway, he was born and raised in Columbia, South Carolina. His father was a sharecropper, and Glenn was born with a hare lip. That's H-A-R-E lip. I did see some people commenting on Facebook that he had a hair lip, H-A-I-R lip. No, that's called a mustache. But hair lip is basically a cleft lip, really. And he had surgery to correct it, but he was bullied throughout school because of the scar. And the bullying got so bad that he dropped out before he even finished 8th grade. But Glenn did a short stint in the U.S. Air Force, and his commanding officer relegated him to bathroom duty, supposedly so that both Glenn and his hair lip could be kept out of the commanding officer's sight. He was medically discharged from the Air Force, and then he went to a school called Opportunity School and earned what I guess would be the equivalent of a GED, which itself is an equivalent now that I think about it. But anyway, over time, Glenn Turner had many failed businesses until he worked at a cosmetic sales company called Holiday Magic. And there he made $250,000 within his first 8 months on the job, outselling fellow distributor Zig Ziglar. Turner's experience with Holiday Magic inspired him to start his own cosmetic marketing company, Coscot Interplanetary Inc. Coscot, that is K-O-S-C-O-T, is kind of an acronym, even though it's not spelled all capital letters, but it stands for Cosmetics for the Communities of Tomorrow. I wasn't able to ascertain exactly when he started that company, but it was probably late 1966 or early 1967, and he set up shop in Orlando, specifically for 2 reasons. Number 1, Turner was a fan of outer space and space travel, so he wanted to be somewhat close to Cape Canaveral. And number 2, it was near the site of where the Walt Disney Corporation bought up a ton of land with plans to build an amusement park. Sound familiar? Long story short, and believe me, there's a long story involved, Coscot was essentially a multi-level marketing company, and it sold mink oil-based cosmetics. Sellers would hawk the products at parties, much like you would do with Tupperware, and they would also sell the stuff door to door. Glenn Turner was so successful with Coscot that he started many other companies, including Westware, which was a stainless steel cookware company, Glen Air, which was an airline, Soundcot, that's capital S, capital O, capital U, capital N, C-O-T, which was a record label, the Orlando Patriots, which was a semi-professional football team, and, of course, Dare to Be Great Incorporated. According to Turner, he eventually ended up with 78 corporations during his heyday. I'll throw in a few tidbits about Glenn Turner at this point, such as how on September 14th, 1971, during the Coscot Congress Convention in Orlando, he was presented with 2 Gold Album Awards for sales of over 600,000 copies of the albums called G.W. Turner and You Can Better Your Best, both of which were on Soundcot Records. How do I know this? Well, quite simple. There was a full-page ad taken out in the October 16th, 1971 issue of Record World, complete with a picture of Glenn Turner and Soundcot president Bobby Lee Trammell holding the gold records. Who presented the gold records? Not the RIAA, but Trammell, maybe it's Trammell, T-R-A-M-M-E-L, himself. These were obviously custom-made awards because if you listen to this podcast regularly, you know that I get a little bit suspicious when I hear about gold and platinum records. So guess what I did? That's right. I looked this up in the Recording Industry Association of America Gold and Platinum Database. Spoiler alert, I know, big shocker, no Glenn Turner records exist in that database. And these two records would never appear in their database because the RIAA would never give gold record awards for combined sales of multiple titles. If they did, the Beach Boys would have a multi-platinum award for combined sales of Endless Summer and Summer in Paradise. Aside from the hair lip, Glenn had a few other, bodily imperfections. He had false teeth. And even as a young adult, he wore a hairpiece. He had a custom toupee made. And also, he spoke with a speech impediment. And I'll get back to that in a moment. Now, Glenn W. Turner came across as right-wing because he had very deep Southern roots, unquestioning respect for the office of the President of the United States. He was very religious, and he was always wearing a flashy American flag pin on his lapel. But he was actually a moderate Democrat. Glenn was against the Vietnam War. He was outraged when he found out that one of his black employees was denied a lease because of his skin color. And in fact, 8 of his other employees who lived in the same building threatened to move out if the landlord did not change his mind. Turner even employed young hippies with long hair, and he let them keep their hair long. All he cared was that they had good hygiene. Turner ran for senator as a Democrat in the 1974 primary and as a state senator in 1978. He lost both times. Another interesting thing about Glenn Turner is that Florida companies rallied against a corporate tax, but Glenn spoke out in favor of a corporate tax, saying that it was only fair and just that companies who made it big share their good fortune with the state where it was allowed to happen. Turner considered starting a newspaper in Orlando because he was unhappy with how the existing paper would either disparage, or even worse, ignore him. For a time, Glenn considered starting a dog cosmetics company, which he felt had $5 million annual potential that was untapped. He also sponsored a Miss Orlando beauty contest, and he gave each of the contestants $100 and told them, and I quote, "Go out and buy a real pretty dress." Now, you might be thinking that Glenn Turner may have been eccentric, and he probably was. He owned several private jets, and he also had a castle with an accompanying boathouse built on Bear Gully Lake in Winter Park, just outside of Orlando. He never got to finish the castle, but apparently it was a must-visit on Halloween. The castle was hit by arson sometime in 1988, but the castle's boathouse still exists, and if you want to visit it, it's at 4082 Scarlet Iris Place. In 2018, the Orange Observer published an article about Glenn Turner and the castle, and it has a few pictures of the inside of the boathouse, and I'll share a link to the article in this podcast's show notes at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. Now, Glenn Turner's business stirred up some controversy, to say the least. Costco was considered a pyramid scheme, and ergo, Glenn faced numerous lawsuits from both the federal government and from former employees, the first such lawsuit happening in 1969. And in fact, by 1973, there were over 1,000 lawsuits seeking a total of almost $1 billion in damages. In 1975, in exchange for having felony charges against him dropped, Glenn Turner pleaded guilty to 1 count of securities violation, which was a misdemeanor, and for that he received probation. But it did lead to bankruptcy, and he ended up selling Costco. And the buyer found that Costco, and I quote, had generated $169 million, still had assets of $11 million, but owed $33 million. Dare to Be Great Inc. had already been shut down by 1972, but in 1979, with very little money, Glenn W. Turner launched a new motivational company called Challenge Inc., which was essentially a resurrection of Dare to Be Great, including the same issues that came along with it. This time, however, Turner was actually convicted in running a pyramid scheme and served several years in prison. When he was released, he planned to sell motivational recordings, but without a distributorship so that he could avoid any accusations of running a pyramid scheme. He estimated that he could make $22 million in the first 3 years, and he planned to use the first $2 million he'd receive to pay back his friends who took care of his wife and kids while he was in prison. In 1982, he wrote and published a memoir called Turner, 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 The King of Network Marketing. Eventually, Glenn Turner was divorced, he got remarried, and in fact, he'd be married 4 times in total during his life, and he started a successful mail-order nutrition company, and he continued to be a motivational speaker, which is what he was probably most known for, outside of his controversies, of course. He also continued selling informational media on video cassettes, audio tapes, CDs, and DVDs. Glenn Turner died on January 8th, 2020 at his home in Lake Mary, Florida, about 15 miles north of his unfinished castle. I wasn't able to find what his cause of death was, but it may have been related to dementia. I don't have official word on that, but one comment I saw from somebody who says he knew Glenn Turner said that he crossed paths with Glenn in 2015, but Glenn didn't remember anybody that he knew well at the time, so he was showing signs of possible dementia. Again, I don't know that for a fact. It's just something that I read about from a person who may or may not have been accurate. But I talked about Glenn Turner, but one thing I do have to talk about is the subject of the record, and that is the Dare to Be Great program. What exactly was it? It was a self-motivation course that Glenn Turner predicted would become, and I quote, the international language of the world. When he started Dare to Be Great, he reached out to Earl Nightingale, of all people,
mature,
and Zig Ziglar and asked them to help start the company with him. Well, both of them turned him down. Earl Nightingale was on contract with Holiday Magic, so working with Glenn Turner would be a conflict of interest. Zig Ziglar's response, however, was, according to Turner, "I don't think you're going to make it, sport." One of the basic tenets of the Dare to Be Great program is that within every person lies a great pool of untapped resources that are doomed to grow stagnant. Now, Glenn Turner originally was going to call the program Dare to Be Big, but then he was concerned that women, particularly plus-sized women, would take it literally, and after all, they don't want to be bigger. Glenn hoped that the course would eventually be brought into every school in America. He said, if we could start each day with Dare to Be Great, then there'd be no more student protest. Course materials came in a large black briefcase with 20 cassette tapes, a tape recorder, and a white plastic notebook that was essentially the transcript of the contents of the audio tapes. Each chapter was called an orbit. Remember, Glenn was very much into the space program. The course itself was split up into 4 adventures, as he called them, and the course would cost upwards of $5,000. And remember, this was around 1970-ish, so we're talking a little bit over $41,000 today. One organization who expressed interest and had Glenn address them in person, the Chicago White Sox. I don't think they actually bought the program, though. In 1972, Illinois Attorney General William Scott moved to ban Dare to Be Great from doing business in Illinois, claiming that it violated the Consumer Fraud Act, the Illinois Deceptive Practices Act, and the Illinois Lottery Act. Many other states also followed suit, so Dare to Be Great had folded by 1972. Now let's talk about the record, Dare to Be Great. Given that this is an audio podcast, I really have to describe the actual album. I actually bought this new. It was still sealed. It was never opened before. So it was a pretty exciting moment to open this and wash it and play it. But anyway, the front and back covers are essentially the left part and the right part of a mock-up of a $1 million bill. The front cover has the words "Dare to Be Great" in a big all-capital yellow font with a green outline. And by the way, it's "Dare to Be Great!" exclamation point. And underneath that, in a serifed all-capital letters font in green, it says Glenn W. Turner. And there's a picture of Glenn W. Turner right there, with the American flag pin on his lapel, and he's holding a pen and writing something apparently. And even though his picture is on the cover, it is not in the middle of this phony dollar bill, as it were. So it's not like he's putting himself on a bill. And on the back, I will read you the description. The back, of course, is the right part of the $1 million bill. It says here, "What's more important than money? You are the you that wants to be great, to do great things. The you that wants what money can buy, not for yourself alone, but for all the people you want to help. Most everyone thinks a lot about money. We use it to measure our success or failure, but we're afraid to do the bold, daring things, to take the big risks that are necessary for real success. Now, Glenn W. Turner, the sharecropper's son who became a multimillionaire in 3 short years, shares with you his secrets of success. He tells you his thoughts about the true values of life, and he challenges you to think $1 million thoughts about your life. Glenn Turner dares you to be great." Aren't you inspired? As for the actual vinyl itself, hear that? That's the record. It is a very, very, very thin record. You see, thick vinyl does not make this sound. And quite frankly, it's very cheaply made. I bought this new. It had never been opened before, and even after cleaning it, it plays back with a lot of surface noise. When you hear the recording of it that I made and put on YouTube, and the little bits you hear in this episode, I actually took out a lot of surface noise by hand using Audacity and the repair functionality. But yeah, it was not made very well. The sound quality is pretty lo-fi, even though it says here on the back cover that it is a high fidelity recording. Mind you, thin and flimsy vinyl does not in and of itself indicate that it's a bad record necessarily. I might have mentioned before, I have a couple of those RCA Dynaflex records, those things that are just about as floppy as this, but they sound fantastic. What makes a record sound good is the quality of the vinyl itself. I seriously doubt that this record was pressed on virgin vinyl. It was probably recycled. And also the mastering counts. You can hear Glenn clearly. The sound itself, I guess, is okay. It's just the vinyl itself is just very crackly, very scratchy, just not good quality. Now, the label, now the record is on Soundcott Records, obviously, and the label is a plain yellow label with black text, the Soundcott logo up at the top. It says Soundcott Records USA. To the left of the spindle hole, it says in most bland, actually the whole thing is the most bland sans serif font, but on the left it says Positive Publisher, arranged and produced by Bobby Lee Trammell, 33 1/3 RPM. On the right of the spindle hole, it has the catalog number and the matrix number, and it says Side 1 Stereo. Below the spindle hole, it says Dare to Be Great by Glenn W. Turner. And of course, Side 2, same thing, except it says Side 2. Now, interestingly, the label says stereo, but it actually plays back in mono. Side 1 runs for roughly 22.5 minutes, and Side 2 runs for about 24.5 minutes. So what exactly is this record all about? Well, the record contains a live recording of Glenn W. Turner addressing what I believe are employees who are about to be trained in selling the Dare to Be Great program. The recording was done somewhere in Nashville. You hear Glenn, you hear the audience react, you hear them laugh at his jokes and things, but really, I think he was just addressing people who were interested in selling the Dare to Be Great course. This was not meant to motivate people into buying the course, but to basically introduce people to the world of selling the course. The first thing you hear is an intro by Clyde C. Cobb, who, according to the back cover of the album, is the international president of Dare to Be Great, Inc. He spends 6 minutes, 52.5 seconds introducing Glenn W. Turner. Clyde Cobb sounds a lot like Dawes Butler. I know I said that about Dr. Winston in the Auto Harp episode. Clyde Cobb sounds even more like Dawes Butler.
He would like to be remembered as the person who was greater than his dad and will leave behind him a heritage for his children to become greater than him.
The intro is 6 minutes, 52 and a half seconds long. He refers to Glenn as
an international traveler who spans the length and breadth of this continent in his jet.
Just interjecting a little opinion here. If the program is so successful, wouldn't you think that other employees would have their own jets too? Anyway, he also calls Glenn Turner
a phenomenon in his time, a man that you'll read about in history.
Oh boy, isn't he correct? Seriously, put Glenn W. Turner in your favorite search engine. You are going to see a lot about him. Now, unfortunately, Clyde's microphone picks up a lot of mouth noises. I find that quite distracting. You hear a lot of going on.
You'll find that the obstacles that you face every day will give you the key to success, and we believe that that's good judgment.
But anyway, eventually Glenn Turner comes out to a raucous ovation, and he tells the crowd very little about the Dare to Be Great program. He talks about the 4 adventures or chapters in the program. He mostly talks about believing in yourself. He doesn't tell you how to believe in yourself, but he tells anecdotes about some unnamed people who work for him, who now have X amount of money and can do this and can do that. Now, something about listening to Glenn Turner talk is that his speech impediment is very apparent on this recording. And in fact, Clyde Cobb, during his intro, even warned people about his speech impediment and told people to listen very carefully because of that speech impediment.
I was no less confident in myself that I went to sharecroppers to sell my ware. And the only reason I was a salesman, no one would hire me and give me a job. I could not beat the crowd without my knees knocking. A crowd of 3 or 4 people. Glenn Turner, they come a long ways.
Glenn several times referred to his hair lip that he had to deal with during his youth.
Because when I first tried to be great, my lawyer told me that I was going in with a phony philosophy, that I couldn't become a millionaire, that I had a hair lip.
But all in all, Glenn Turner talked for about 40 minutes on the record, and really it's hard to tell exactly what he was really talking about. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But really, that is the record. It's basically just a semi-motivational speech, I guess, to potential Dare to Be Great sellers, but with not a lot of concrete how-tos involved.
Most people are afraid. And Dare to Be Great is the hardest course you'll ever sell to man. You can sell a product because everybody believes in a product. But when you sell Dare to Be Great, really all you're selling is a man's belief in himself.
But the guy definitely had a lot of gusto, a lot of presence, if you will.
You see, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd have been born in Russia, you'd be a communist. But you're born in America, so you're American.
And really, that's really all I have to say about the Dare to Be Great album. So I might as well move right into what I like to call Sean's record collecting thoughts. Now, my record collecting thoughts aren't really related to Dare to Be Great, but it's just something that crossed my mind in the last month. Did you ever notice that on some 7-inch records, there are ridges around the label? Not all 7-inch records have them, but some do. A few of particular interest are late 60s Capitol repressings of Beatles singles, the ones with yellow and orange rainbow swirls. Most Beatles singles on Capitol did not have ridges on the label, but a few did, and they're pretty sought after. I mention these singles only as an example, but of course there are many other 7-inchers in the wild that have those ridges. But why are they there? I'm about to say something that some record collectors may consider to be sacrilege. Those ridges are there specifically to facilitate playback on stacking turntables. Yeah, you're probably told, don't stack your records, those old stackers are bad for your records. That might be true for, say, albums and other 12-inch records, but not necessarily for 7-inch records. 7-inchers are typically more durable and, quite honestly, were originally made specifically to be played on stacking turntables. And I'll give you a bit of history behind that. The 7-inch record was introduced by RCA Victor, who brought it to the market in late March 1949. These 7-inchers were microgroove vinyl records that played back at 45 RPM and were meant to be offered as an alternative to the old-fashioned 10-inch wide-grooved shellac records that were the norm. The sound quality was a bit better than those of the old shellacs, and the playing time was on par, and the records were supposedly more convenient because of their small size. But why 7 inches, and why did they have a huge spindle hole instead of the relatively tiny spindle hole that you'd find on a 12-inch LP or a 10-inch shellac record? Quite simply, it was marketing and competition. So let me start from the beginning with that, going all the way back to the Edison cylinders, that is, those wax records devised by Thomas Edison. The machines that played those cylinders were operated by a hand crank, so there was no such thing as a standard steady playback speed. The phonographs were cranked at whatever speed sounded right and felt natural, and that speed was estimated to be roughly 80 revolutions per minute. That was a slow enough speed to fit roughly 5 minutes of audio onto a cylinder, and fast enough for decent audio fidelity, at least for that kind of technology. In 1888, an immigrant from Hanover, Germany named Emil Berliner invented a disc record. He designed it to approximate the standards set by the Edison cylinder, 5 minutes of playing time at speeds somewhere between 70 and 80 RPM. The disc was meant to be played on a new device called a gramophone, and by the way, 10 years later, Berliner started a few companies: the Gramophone Company of London, Berliner Gramophone of Canada, and Deutsche Grammophon. Perhaps you've heard of at least one of those companies. In 1925, thanks to the addition of an electric motor, playback speed of gramophones could be standardized, and it was decided that that speed would be 78.26 revolutions per minute. At around that same time, there was a new electrical system of making recordings as opposed to acoustical, and that system significantly improved the sound, and that meant that a record now didn't have to spin that fast to sound good. It was found that 33 1/3 RPM would be a good speed, but there was a problem: radio. Radio was becoming popular, and there was a fear that people would prefer radio over buying record players, so the commercial introduction of a 33 1/3 RPM player was shelved. Instead, there were 33 1/3 players that were built but relegated to studios and radio stations. And the idea wasn't really totally shelved. RCA Victor tried and failed to market a 33 RPM turntable in 1931. Now, that 33 1/3 speed was largely forgotten about until a Hungarian immigrant named Dr. Peter Goldmark, who was working for Columbia Records, pioneered microgroove records. As the term implies, the grooves on these records were much smaller than those on the standard 10-inch 78 shellac discs, and ergo a microgroove record could hold significantly more audio. And by the way, the different groove sizes mean that you need different sized styluses to play these records. I might have mentioned this before, but if you have old shellac 78s, make sure that you have a stylus specifically designed to play those old shellac 78s. You can get one for most modern turntables nowadays. Playing the wrong stylus on the wrong type of groove can result in damage to the stylus and or the record. But getting back to this little history here, let's go to 1948 when Columbia Records president Godard Lieberson introduced the 12-inch microgroove 33 1/3 RPM record, also known as the LP, short for long player. And by the way, this is why for many years, only albums by Columbia Records could legally be called LPs. Columbia marketed these new microgroove records specifically to classical music fans who could now enjoy entire symphony suites without having to change or flip the record every 5 minutes. And because Columbia wanted 33 1/3 to be the new standard speed, the company made the long-playing microgroove process available for free to any record label who wanted to use it. Well, who wouldn't want to use that process? I'll tell you who wouldn't. RCA Victor, who decided to come up with their own microgroove recordings that would be pressed on 7-inch 45 RPM records along with a special player on which to play them. The large spindle hole on those records would mean that if you wanted to play the records, your only option was RCA Victor's record player, which had a wide spindle, spun at 45 RPMs, and had an automatic stacker so that you could listen to several songs in a row without having to take a record off or flip it over or change it. And by the way, that spindle size also meant you could not play anybody else's records on the RCA Victor units. Well, the speed too. I mean, there was 45 and that was it. And those 45 RPM records were built specifically to withstand stacking, being slightly thicker on the inner part of the record so that when the records were stacked, the playing surfaces would not touch each other and risk scratching. While Columbia marketed 12-inch LPs to classical music buffs, RCA Victor marketed their 7-inch 45s to popular music fans, saying that the 7-inch size and the 45 RPM speed was ideal for playback of popular music. It turned out, though, that most consumers preferred the long players, but still RCA Victor stubbornly refused to market anything but their 7-inch 45s for the next 18 months. And during that time, it became apparent to the record-buying public that there was a speed war going on. I guess you could compare that to, say, VHS versus beta, Blu-ray versus HD DVD, whatever else have you. So customers simply, by and large, held off on buying records just to wait and see if one of those standards would be settled on, but as we all know by now, there was no settled on standard. In 1950, RCA Victor finally took on the Columbia LP system, but continued to also produce 7-inch 45s. Of course, record players would soon be available with switchable speeds, and the thin spindle would be the universal default, with various kinds of adapters available to fit the larger spindle holes of the 7-inch records. Now, what I'm surprised didn't happen in the United States, at least not much, if at all, is what happened in Europe and possibly other continents. 7-inch records designed to accommodate either sized spindle. Many people are familiar with 7-inch singles from, say, the UK, where there's a small spindle hole, but you could punch out the inner ring to make the record fit on a larger spindle hole. And that's why UK singles with the punch-out still intact are worth more than those with the inner rings punched out. What if you had a 7-inch record that had the tiny spindle hole, but you only had, say, the RCA Victor record player that had the large spindle? Well, guess what? There are devices on the market to this day that will cut a larger spindle hole into those records. I would never use one myself, and they're really only useful if your only source of playback is that RCA Victor record player with the large spindle. But going back to those ridges that you might find on a 7-inch record, you probably concluded that those are there to basically help the stacked records interlock so that they don't slip during playback. And that is, of course, exactly why those ridges are there. And you also know now why there are also different size spindle holes and different speeds. Most of the information I gave you came from the March 12th, 1976 edition of Cecil Adams' syndicated semi-underground newspaper column, The Straight Dope, and you can find the article online. I will link it in the show notes at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. That article is also available as an old-fashioned paper and ink write-up. There are 5 published books of the Straight Dope column, and this particular article is in the first volume titled The Straight Dope, A Compendium of Human Knowledge. I highly recommend all 5 volumes, especially because not all articles from those books are online. But, my friends, now that you know more about the evolution from cylinder records and the speeds from, say, 80 RPMs to 78 RPM to 33 and 45, just please don't ask me about those oddball speeds that you find on some acetate discs, because the answer is simply, I don't know. All right, my friends, it is time to rate the Dare to Be Great record. And as a reminder of those of you who've been listening to this podcast in the past, and also this is new information for new listeners, every time I talk about a record on this podcast, I rank it on a scale of 1 through 5 inclusive, each on 5 factors. So that means that every record's going to have a score of somewhere between 5 and 25 inclusive. The first thing I rate on is local interest or usefulness based on what the record's about. Is it more about local focus or is it more on utility? I also consider historical interest. Is the recording an interesting sign of its time? Does it take you back to a certain era? Other things that I rate the records on are uniqueness, weirdness, and enjoyability. Now, this is going to be one of those times when I do my first rating based on both criteria, usefulness and local interest. I was actually thinking about not even considering local interest until I put Glenn W. Turner in the search engine and found multiple threads about him in some Orlando-focused Facebook groups. The man lived, worked, and died in and near Orlando. He was all about Orlando, and Orlando, in a way, was all about Glenn W. Turner. So for local interest, I'd say Dare to Be Great gets a 5. But here's the thing. This record is supposed to serve a function, so I have to rate the usefulness too. What that function it serves, though, is pretty unclear. I mean, I've listened to this thing several times, and I couldn't figure out what any listener would truly get out of it. It's mostly just Glenn Turner talking about people who benefited greatly monetarily from selling the Dare to Be Great program. He doesn't give any hints. He doesn't say, here's how you do it. All he says really is just be confident in yourself. So I'm going to rate the usefulness a 1. But because this particular rating is supposed to be local interest and or usefulness, I have to average those two figures together and give the local interest and usefulness a combined rating of 3. Now, historical interest. Well, at least from what I learned in prepping for this episode, Glenn W. Turner sure left his mark for better or for worse, or maybe even for better and worse. His name is almost synonymous with multi-level marketing. And in fact, multi-level marketing laws didn't even exist until after he started his companies. If people remember him for anything else, it's certainly his flamboyant personality and his eccentricity. I mean, the guy had multiple private jets. He wore flashy suits. He had a solid gold wristwatch with an engraving that read, "To Glenn W. Turner, the greatest guy in the world, from Glenn W. Turner, the greatest guy in the world." He gave himself that watch when he was 33 years old because he didn't want to wait until his retirement age of 65 to get a gold watch. A former acquaintance of his talked about the all-white decor of Glenn Turner's office, and it had a sparkly ceiling. He said that the office was apparently based on heaven. Some remember Glenn Turner for changing their lives for the worse, while others remember him for improving their lives. The fact is, the man had an impact and very well might have been the cause of multi-level marketing laws to exist in the first place. I was originally thinking of rating the Dare to Be Great album 4 for historical interest, but no, I think I'm going to bump it up to 5. Now, how about uniqueness? Well, honestly, there's not much unique about the record itself. I mean, records of motivational speakers are pretty common, and, well, Glenn Turner's products, including his audio recordings, were plentiful, and by all accounts, they sold pretty well. A quick check on Discogs.com shows that 50 users, including me, claim to own the album, and that 10 copies are for sale. On eBay, I did see 2 copies for sale, one for $25 and another for $68, but please save your money. On Discogs.com, the lowest selling price was $1.50 and the highest was $3.99. I got ripped off because I paid $4.99 for my copy at Lori's Planet of Sound in Chicago on December 3rd, 2023. Could have saved myself $1 by going through Discogs. Basically, if you want the record, you'll probably be able to find it, especially if you're among the first 10 to buy it on Discogs. So I'll give the uniqueness rating 1 out of 5. Weirdness, though. Motivational records in and of themselves are really not all that weird, but I have to say that I was puzzled as to how to describe this record. That certainly gives the weirdness rating at least somewhere in the middle. This isn't the weirdest record I've ever heard, but that it takes Glenn Turner about 40 minutes to say, well, virtually nothing. That's weird enough for me to give the weirdness factor a rating of 4. And finally, enjoyability. How enjoyable is this record? I have to admit that when Clyde Cobb's introduction talked about listening to Glenn for the next hour, I was turned off immediately. I didn't want to sit around for an hour to listen to some guy babble. I was only slightly relieved to find out that I'd be listening for only about 46 minutes. And listening was a bit difficult too because of Glenn Turner's speech impediment. I mean, you know how it is. If somebody has a speech impediment or maybe a really thick foreign accent, it's much easier to understand a person's speech when you look at them as opposed to just listening to them. So that might be a thing here too. And by the way, according to one person who knew Glenn Turner, the speech impediment may have been fake. He may have only adapted that while public speaking because this person said that in private, he spoke perfectly clearly. I can't verify that for a fact. It's just what I saw somebody else say. But speech impediment or not, Glenn Turner and even Clyde Cobb said nothing mind-blowing, and there's a lot of repetition. Dare to Be Great is not the most boring album I've ever heard, but it's also not the most interesting. He does crack a couple of jokes and gets the audience to laugh. I mean, so I guess that's something. So I'll give the enjoyability rating a 2. Now, let's get to the composite score of Dare to Be Great. That's an average of 3 for local interest and usefulness, 5 for historical interest, 1 for uniqueness, 4 for weirdness, and 2 for enjoyability. That means for the first time in history of the My Weird Record Collection podcast, the ratings have every integer between 1 and 5 inclusive. But regardless, the composite score is 15, placing it 1 position above George C. Wallace campaign favorites and 1 position below Get More from Your Kenmore. So my friends, that was, well, I don't know if that was everything I could tell you about Dare to Be Great because, well, there's a plethora of information out there, but at least I gave you enough to fill up a podcast episode. And just some concluding thoughts about Glenn W. Turner. He's one of those guys whose name, when you mention, will get probably one of 2 responses. Either, oh, that crook, or, oh, he was such a nice guy. There's very little in between about him. And really, you do a search for Glenn W. Turner, you're going to find a lot of people who have nothing but kind things to say about him. Even from one person who didn't do so well with the Dare to Be Great program. He said, yeah, I didn't really do a good job with it, mainly because I didn't put a lot of effort into it, but I'm confident that if I did, I would have ended up in a much better situation. In fact, Glenn Turner even mentions that in the Dare to Be Great speech on the record. He says the harder you work, the more likely you're going to make this money that I'm saying that you have the potential to make. He says, the only place where success comes before work is in the dictionary. The thing about that is, though, that investigators found that in the pyramid of Dare to Be Great and Costcott, within a few layers of the pyramid, to make the full potential money that Glenn Turner mentions, more people have to be under you in the pyramid than literally the number of people that actually exist. Some people say that Glenn Turner was given a bad rep and was unjustly arrested, unjustly sued, that the government was after him because they were just suspicious of how he became successful so quickly. That might be the case. Maybe it's not. But whatever the case, when he did prison time, after he got out of prison, he said that he did a heck of a lot more good than he did bad. And that might be the case. I don't know. Whether he was a scoundrel or a saint, the fact is, the guy made a heck of an impact on people, and I'm not going to pass judgment either way because I simply just don't know. Do you have any thoughts on the whole matter or the record or anything out there related to this podcast? Well, I'll tell you how you can do that, and then I'll tell you a little bit about next month's episode. My email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com, and fab4it is spelled FAB, the number 4, IT. The website for this podcast, including the show notes for each episode, can be found on a website whose address is very similar to the email address, and that is myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. And while you're there, hey, consider clicking on the link that says Buy Me a Coffee. What that does is you do that and you can donate a few bucks toward keeping this podcast going. Even though it says Buy Me a Coffee, I'm not going to have coffee, or at least if I get coffee, I'm not going to drink it because I do not like coffee. You can also reach out to me on the various social networks. My handle is My Weird Records. I'm on Blue Sky, Twitter, Instagram, and by default, that means I should also be on Threads, so maybe I should look into that as well. Also on Facebook, you can simply search for My Weird Record Collection in the Facebook search engine or go directly to facebook.com/MyWeirdRecords. My Weird Record Collection is also on YouTube, where you'll find not only episodes of this podcast, but also, whenever possible, audio of the records that I discuss, and occasional bonus video here and there that is related to my weird records and my not so weird records. You can just search for My Weird Record Collection in the YouTube search engine, or go straight to youtube.com/@My Weird Record Collection. And speaking of putting the audio of the records up, I should also disclaim that sounds and music used in this podcast are the property of their respective copyright holders, and they are used for commentary and review. Igatur, infringement is not intended. Big huge thanks to Tim Christ, also known as Shoebox, also known as Worm Quartet, for letting me use his record, the Pac-Man EP, as the basis of the logo for this podcast. Tim and his unforgettable and unregrettable music can be found on his website at worm-quartet.web.app. Big, huge honkin' thanks goes to my buddy Kevin Zerby for designing the logo artwork for this podcast, using Tim's Pac-Man EP, by the way. Kevin and his music and his podcasts, including his latest, called Mono, are available on the web at zerbinator.com. Now, next month is September 2025, and in September there are several unofficial holidays, observances involving pets and dogs, including Deaf Dog Awareness Week, National Pet Tricks Day, and whatever else have you. So, gonna take a look at a record involving dogs. So join me on September 15th, assuming weird things don't happen to get in the way. And I will remind you, as I always do, support your local record store. This is Sean saying bye-bye.
My secret of success is I'm a user of LSD. The real drug. A drug that can really turn you on.